Right now, our country is at a crossroads. At the Australia Institute, we're fighting for big, bold ideas, like making big gas pay, like creating a fairer tax system, and protecting our democracy. But we can't do it without your support. By making a tax-deductible donation to our end of financial year appeal, you'll help fund the research that is changing Australia for the better. You can give now by visiting our website, australiainstitute.org.au, or via the link in the show notes.
For more than 30 years, the Australia Institute has been producing research that matters. But how do you turn big, bold ideas into positive change? In this series, I'm speaking to some of the best thinkers about how we can make change for the better. I'm Paul Barclay, and this is What's the Big Idea, brought to you by the Australian Institute. And today, I'm speaking to Sunita Narain, environmentalist and writer and Director General of the Centre of Science and Environment. Hello, Sunita.
Hi, Paul. Good to be with you.
Sunita, you have written, in calling for a green transformation, we need to make sure it's an inclusive transformation, not an inequitable transformation. Can you talk a bit about that? You're speaking to me from Delhi. What would an inclusive and sustainable growth look like there?
Very good question, Paul. And I think this is what we in the Global South have been grappling with for quite a while. Because if you look at the environmental movement across the world, it has looked at the issue of equity, the issue of inclusion, as something that is beyond the issue of environmentalism. That you look at sustainability and then you add on to it the lens of equity and inclusion. And that's a discussion for the politics of the future. But for us in the Global South, we have learned that if we don't talk about it together, if it's not intertwined, then it does not lead to any meaningful change. Let me explain it to you. For instance, take my city of Delhi. I'm sure the news has traveled to Australia that, we have a terrible problem of air pollution in our city. Now, the reason, and if you look at the way we have to handle that air pollution problem is that if you take the strategies that came out of the rest of the world was, okay, you clean up the tailpipe of your cars, you clean up the level of fuel, and you somehow deal with pollution. Now, that's a half solution, Paul, because, we know that transport adds to the emissions that are in the atmosphere. So maybe Melbourne, maybe Sydney, maybe Canberra and Perth are cleaner in terms of air quality than Delhi. But please be very, very clear that the vehicles that run in your city are leading to an existential problem called climate change. But I digress a bit there. My question for us in Delhi has been, so how do we deal with pollution? We have the bulk of our people still are too poor to take even a bus. They take a cycle or they walk to work. And they do that because of poverty. They don't do that because it's fashionable to take a bicycle. Yet, Delhi is building its city as all cities in the world do, which is a car-centric city. Now, that means that we are taking away the footpaths where people could walk. We are not giving them the right to cross a road. We are building large roads because as cities fill up with cars, we have to expand our roads. Now, all that has meant that we are essentially making sure that the mobility of the rich is leading to the pollution in the air. But if we are serious about handling air pollution, then we have to reinvent mobility so that it's not about the movement of vehicles, but the movement of people. And this becomes important for us because if we want the right to clean air, then the way we drive and we provide space for the entire city to be able to move. And as people become richer, they can buy a car, but they have the option of not using the car, becomes the only way for us to secure our right to clean air. So inclusion, affordability becomes critical for sustainability. We cannot clean our cities just by focusing on the tailpipe of cars. And this has really been a very hard lesson for us and an important lesson because we have to now reinvent the way we do growth, sustainable growth. But sustainable growth is about inclusive development.
And toxic air pollution is a particularly interesting example because it affects everybody, including the rich. They can't avoid it. They may be able to avoid, say, polluted water by drinking bottled water, but they can't avoid polluted air. So presumably, they are demanding a greater effort to address this as well as the poor. And does that mean they'd be willing to give up, for example, their private vehicles?
That's the hardest question. you know, the logic goes that far and not far enough. And we are seeing that across the world. Okay. Your point is absolutely right. And I keep making that statement in India saying that, our rivers may be polluted, but we can switch to bottled water. But the fact is, if you're rich, if you're poor, you still need to breathe the air. And you need to breathe the air, and air is a great equalizer, it's a great leveler. In some senses, the parallel is climate change. I mean, the fires in LA, the fires in Australia, and the floods in India tell us that we are part of one planet Earth. And that's really air pollution for us. It brings it home that it's a great leveler. And the fact is that the rich and the SUVs of the rich will have to make space for the development rights of the poor. The trouble is, and you're absolutely right, and you've hit the nail on the head, that when it comes to that final push, and I think it's to do with not just individuals, we hate giving up something, but it's to do with the way state designs its policies. If the state was to really push for public transport in a scale that it becomes easy for me not to take my car out. Okay. And the state also incentivizes public transport and disincentivizes private transport, increases the parking charges, makes it more difficult for people to be able to take the vehicles out. Then I think, so the regulatory policy is equally important, Paul, because if we don't do that and we just leave it to individuals, then yes, people are not going to be. I mean, in Delhi, the conversation every winter is there is an outrage, and you're right, the rich are hit. They are affected, their children's health is affected, they are angry. And this time, air pollution has made it into the votes that have gone for voting for the government as well. So there is no question about it. But there is an effort to be able to find a scapegoat, which is not you. So it's the farmers who pollute because they burn their crops and their pollution comes into the city of Delhi, or the dust is the problem, or something else is the problem. I call it the 1% problem. Somebody else is the problem, not me. So I think it's a matter of really getting the policy right. And for this, Paul, the conversation we're having is very important, because unless we start understanding the imperative of inclusion, the imperative of affordability in the conversation on sustainability, we will not get our strategies right, because otherwise we keep looking for strategies which are technocentric, which somehow make the problem worse, in fact, not better. And that's really where the conversation has to be, that for us in the global South, and frankly, I believe for all of us, South or North, we have to start looking at climate justice, on equity and affordability, if we want sustainability.
I think transportation is very interesting. Only about 25% of the citizens in Delhi, I believe, have a private vehicle, yet There's terrible congestion on the roads, terrible pollution, even with that 25%. And as the middle class gets wealthier and more people are out of poverty, there'll be more demand on cars, there'll be more on the road. So in order to deal with that, as you've said, you need better urban transit, but it has to be very good. I mean, if you look at cities like Tokyo or New York or London, wealthy people get public transport because it's quicker and more efficient to move around. Is that type of effort going on in Delhi? Is there an effort to produce high quality public transport?
Oh, absolutely. We have the metro, the subway, and it is absolutely high quality, and it does break the income barrier as well. The problem is more last mile connectivity. So if you can take a metro and you get to a point, but you still need to get to your destination, you need to make sure that you have pavements, you have safety for women. And those are things that the government is working on. There's a lot of effort on it. But remember, we have a unique challenge, Paul. And I think that's where we need to be sure about this and work on it. And I believe we will, and we will succeed. But we need to grapple and understand the scale of the challenge. We have people who are too poor today to even take a bus. Please understand that. Now, they need affordable public transport. They need to be subsidized so that they can take public transport. And then we have rich who need convenience and who need an extremely highly modern public transport system that they feel comfortable in. So it's about making sure that that system is able to cater to the needs of the poor as well as the aspirations and the desire for comfort of the rich. And that's why the scale of this and the design of this has to be thought through much more clearly. It's not about adding a few buses and a few metro lines. It's about designing the system so that these needs are fulfilled. But I think India more and more is understanding this, and there's a huge effort. I mean, one of the best things that the government of India has done, which I feel very happy about, is, in other parts of the world, including Australia, there's a huge focus now on electric vehicles, but it's about individual cars. And I think that's nonsensical. I'll be very clear. I really believe that maybe it's okay for Australia, but it doesn't work for us. We have a limited amount of rare minerals in the world. We need to make sure we can optimize on the transport systems, and we have to make sure that therefore electrification is very well targeted towards what's the maximum but benefits that we can get. And the Indian government has actually focused for the last 10 years its entire vehicle electrification program, not on individual cars, but on buses and on paratransit, which is auto rickshaws and other ways in which you can move people, taxis, auto rickshaws. And I think that's a lesson for the rest of the world, because we are not getting climate politics and policies right. Because as I said, we're looking at it as too technocentric, and we're not adding to it the need for deep emission reduction cuts, which will only happen if we actually redo mobility rather than think about electric cars.
As you write, the world's carbon budget, the amount of carbon dioxide we emit into the atmosphere before we hit that global temperature rise of 1.5 degrees, that carbon budget is running out. Yet many poor households in India rely on biomass. We're talking about cow dung, wood, burning biomass to cook their food. This obviously emits CO2, causes air pollution. How do you deal with that?
Well, again, Paul, it's about poverty and development, and it's about the right to development. In 1992, and I'm old enough to tell you, and not embarrassed about it at all. So tell you that I was at the Rio conference in 1992. And at the Rio conference, our entire focus, and I believe that we succeeded in our generation to bring the politics of development and environment to the global community, for them to understand that, this was not about climate change. It was also about the right to share a finite development space in the world. And that for this, the agreement had to be that the rich would reduce so that the poor had the right to grow. Now, it's often been misconstrued, and I have been abused and accused often to say, oh, you're asking for the right to pollute. No, we are not asking for the right to pollute. We are saying we have the right to development and we want to develop differently. And that's where the context of the technology transfer and the financial assistance was, that we could actually do things differently. We didn't have to do them in the same way that would add to emissions. Now, that was the agreement in 1992. Unfortunately, Paul, for the last many decades, the entire effort has been to derail, erase, negate, neuter the politics of inclusion, the politics of climate justice. But the fact of the matter today is that we are in a situation where it cannot be ignored, not even by the likes of President Trump. And let me make that very clear to you. We are in an existential crisis called climate change. We know that the impacts of climate change are only going to increase as temperatures increase. We also know the fact that this is huge impacts on the rich and the poor of the world. Both are similarly impacted. Now, in this context, let's understand some of the numbers. The fact is that at current rate of emissions, you will exhaust the CO2 budget that will keep the world below 1.5 degrees centigrade rise before the end of this decade. Let me repeat that. At current rates at which we are emitting, the CO2 budget, and that's a finite budget because that relates to the temperature rise, that will be exhausted. Now, that means we need to be able to understand that this exhaustion will happen at a time when 70% of the world population does not have the right to clean electricity, to energy, and the budget is exhausted. Now, you cannot tell that 70% to just go and disappear. It will not happen that you can tell them to just go jump in the ocean and we don't want to. No, they will develop. They will continue to emit. And that will add to the emissions in the atmosphere. Now, this is where the context of the clean energy for the poorest in the world comes in, not just in India, but across Africa. These are women who cook food using biomass, which is bad for their health. And that impacts their health. It adds to local pollution, but it is also an opportunity to the world, because if they were to leapfrog to cleaner emissions, you actually get the entire world to move forward in a way without taking the fossil fuel route. Now, currently, I think one of the best programs of the government of India, and I'll be very clear with you, I know it's a fossil fuel program, but the fact is, if I have the right to cook in my house using clean fossil fuels, then why should the poor women not have that? And so the government of India has a program in which the middle class have been asked to give up their subsidy to liquid petroleum gas, LPG, so that that can be given to the poor in the country, poor women. It's a very important program. Unfortunately, it fails to recognize the fact that if people are too poor, they will get the first cylinder free, but they will not be able to afford the second cylinder. And remember, clean cooking fuel is a wicked problem of the world. It involves the poorest women of the world. Women are the last when it comes to household income decision making, which means that if people have to spend money on cleaner fuel, they're going to say they have other priorities. Now, this really means that there is an option and an opportunity here. If you could provide clean fuel, mini grids, solar mini grids, electricity two villages so that you can provide clean cooking fuel, you get a leapfrog. But that's again why, Paul, the issue of equity, the issue of inclusion is so critical when you talk about climate change. You cannot talk about 70% of the world not having access to development and still believe that we will be able to mitigate the emissions in the future.
India, though, cannot address inclusion and equity domestically entirely. It needs the support of the global north. Or it needs the support from the globe generally, from all countries.
No, Paul, I think that's where today when you and I are talking is a very, I don't know what words to use anymore. I call it a weird time, a surreal time in the world when we are talking. Things that I never thought would happen are in the conversation today. We are being told that the issues of equity, diversity, inclusion are actually woke politics. We are being told that, foreign aid is about only corruption, and that climate is about doing what you can in your own country, or actually doing nothing, even that in your own country. Now, the fact of the matter is, climate change is about the biggest existential threat, but it's also about cooperation at a global scale. And that's where my example of the poor women is about. The fact is that if the world is serious about climate change, then you have to have a global cooperative agreement. And cooperation will only happen when it is built on the principles of justice and equity. So, this is why the Global Cooperation Agreement is so critical on climate change. But it's also very critical that, based on that, and going back to the 1992 agreement, that if you want development to happen differently, then that assistance, that funding, has to happen. So India cannot do it on its own, nor can countries of Africa. We are very clear that we need to find co-benefits. We are not going to work on climate change for climate change alone, but we will work for energy security, clean energy security. And we will do that in a way that we can bring local air benefits as well as global benefits. Now, for that, we need global cooperation. And so I have no qualms in saying this to you, that this is about the responsibility of the world to come together, that we cannot afford to do this finger pointing or letting countries act on their own. It's not going to work.
I'm Paul Barclay. I'm talking to Sunita Narain, environmentalist and writer and Director General of the Centre of Science and Environment. Sunita has contributed a chapter to What's the Big Idea, an anthology of big ideas put together by the Australia Institute. You can purchase it now. It also features chapters by Richard Dennis, Peter Doherty, Yanis Varoufakis, Fiona Stanley, and other leading thinkers. Solutions to our big challenges, they exist. We just need the courage to implement them. What's the Big Idea is available online from the Australia Institute website. Sunita, India is predicted to keep growing economically at a far greater rate, actually, than Western economies. This means more Indians will be lifted out of poverty, and this is a good thing, but it also means more pollution, more CO2 emissions. Do you see growth per se as the problem, or the type of growth?
No, growth is essential, Paul, and let's be very clear about it. We need to double our energy consumption. And I do not want you to please understand this, that this is not about Western flatulent economies. This is about real serious energy poverty. We need growth, we need development, we need industries, and we need to double our energy consumption. The question is, what kind of energy? What is our option to move ahead? The Government of India's plan on this is actually a very interesting plan and a good plan, in my view, and we have supported it publicly for the last some years. against many Western environmentalists, I may say. So the government's plan has been not to replace coal, but to displace coal. Okay. So the idea is that between now and 2030, India will need to double its energy consumption. And today, coal provides 75% of the electricity generation in the country. And the idea is that as we double our energy consumption, our growth of energy will happen in the clean energy sector. So we will essentially, by 2030, coal will be down to 50% of electricity generation, and the remaining 50% would be clean energy sources, wind, solar, hydel. And now, of course, the government is talking about nuclear. I'm not sure where that will add up to, but at least wind, solar, and hydel. So I think it's a plan which essentially takes into account the imperatives of a country like India and makes it clear that we will have to develop, but we also have challenges which we need to deal with. So, for instance, the city of Delhi, we talked about it earlier, has banned the use of coal in Delhi. It has stopped its last coal-based power plant because of local air pollution. But we need electricity. So we generate electricity today, 70% from coal, down to 50%. The question for us is going to be, how do we make sure that the existing coal-based power plants, which will survive by till 2030, become cleaner, less energy intensive, and become much more resource intensive as well. So that's going to be one part of the challenge. And the other part is to increase our emissions, provide energy to large numbers of people, make sure accessibility is part of the drive so that it's not just about the rich of India, but the poorest of women of India get access to cheap electricity. But do that in a way that is driven by clean energy transition.
Yes, at the moment, I think India is the third largest producer of renewable energy in the world. Is that energy transition happening quickly enough?
Well, obviously, for people like me, it's never good enough. But yes, it's happening. And I think there's a clear intent. I mean, at the end of the day, it takes courage and intent, and there is that. But we need to make sure we have that challenge of affordability of energy. And that's for us the biggest issue. I mean, today, Paul, I'm always very amused to hear about how the rich parts of the world are complaining about the price of electricity and therefore not to move towards renewable energy. And we have really poor people who cannot afford even the price of a light bulb. So I think it's important for us to get a perspective on the development needs of large numbers of people and for us to account for that as we move towards a cleaner, more secure transition.
Well, in Australia, we are, of course, a wealthy country, but we are aware that our Pacific Island neighbours face the threat of their islands being inundated by sea level rises due to climate change that is largely the result of wealthy countries like Australia and the affluent ways of life that we've been living through fossil fuels. So there's talk that somewhere down the track we may need to accommodate climate refugees from some of these Pacific Island nations. We're going to see extreme weather displace poor people who are going to have to find places to live. Are you concerned, though, that we globally are not treating this as a globally interconnected issue? I mean, you're seeing the border controls going up and people thinking that they can deal with this problem by policing their borders when this is clearly a global dilemma.
Absolutely, Paul, and I think that's the big issue that we have to confront. That we are looking at these very short-term approaches today of saying let's not invest in clean energy, let's derail the move towards combating climate change. But all this is only going to put further pressure on the poor in the world, and that is going to lead to more and more desire to leave. I mean, the latest report by the International Organization on Migration suggests that new displacement, and they define new displacement as displacement caused because of climate change, floods, droughts, and the associated weather related changes, is more now than old displacement, which was conflict and war. So you will see more. And in our part of the world, we are already beginning. We will see more in terms of rural urban migration. We will see more in terms of the desperation, the growing violence, the insecurity. Now, there is no question that we will need better strategies to handle this. And, I can also understand that the rich nations of the world do not want an influx of people coming in, but they have to recognize that unless there is investment, and this is the big strategy in India, and let me just give you this. So when the worst droughts were hitting India, and this were leading to huge exodus of people from rural to urban India, the Indian government came up with a very innovative policy to tax the rich and to put that money into what is called an guaranteed employment generation program. And the idea was that that money would go into investing in the ecological security of the poorest. So you would build resilience so that people did not need to leave their homes. Please, let's be clear, Paul. Nobody wants to leave. Yes, there are bright lights and there is a desire for aspiration, but your home is your home. And if you ask any migrant in the world that why would they want to leave, they do not want to leave if they can be secured healthcare, education, well-being, and now resilience. So I think that's what we need to focus on, because the migration issue is going to require countries in the world to take a far bigger approach than the close the border that they are doing today.
And just a final question. Do you feel that you are making progress in your push for equitable, sustainable development?
I think we're making progress. I think we're making progress in at least the fact that we are beginning to understand the nature of the challenge, but also the new approach we need to take. And Paul, I want to underline this because we have for so long tried the way the rest of the world has done its pollution management, its resource management, its environmental sustainability challenges, and we have failed. And I think today, the rest in our part of the world, the approach is more important than even the need, just action. And that's really what I think we are beginning to understand: how we do our waste management, how we do our river cleaning, how we manage our city air pollution challenges, how we make sure that we can grow food which is not toxic for the land and toxic for human beings. I mean, these are part of the immediate issues that we have in our part of the world. And I think it's taking a new level of imagination and courage. And I hope we will continue on our path.
And the citizens are increasingly demanding this.
Yes, absolutely. I think people are very clear and vocal. I mean, if you come to India and you use the word climate change, people may not know, poor people, but they understand that the weather is changing. And they understand that this is bad for them. And there is a need to do something differently.
Sunita, great to talk to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Paul.
Sunita Narain is an environmentalist and writer and Director General of the Centre for Science and Environment. The Australia Institute believes in big ideas and delivering research that matters, but we can't do it all alone. We need people like you who understand that real change doesn't come from playing it safe. That's why we're asking for your support. Sign up to our mailing list to get involved, and if you have the means, you can also donate to ensure we can keep fighting for a better, cleaner, fairer Australia. Thanks for listening. Bye for now.
Australia is at a crossroads. With its thumping majority, the Labor government has an opportunity to deliver generational reform. At the Australia Institute, we'll keep fighting to make big gas pay, to build a fairer tax system, and to make the truth matter again. But we can't do it without your support. By making a tax-deductible donation today to our end of financial year appeal, you'll help fund research changing Australia for the better. You can give now by visiting our website, australiainstitute.org.au, or via the link in the show notes.